Speaking first will be Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. He also holds the Tommaso Padociapa Chair at the European University Institute in Florence and was the co-founder of Bruegel, the European think tank, our close partner. Previously, he served as Director of Program and Ideas in Emmanuel Macron's successful presidential bid in France. And he has been an advisor he was from 2013 to 2016, he was Commissioner General of France Strategy. He has also been a significant advisor in many of the European macroeconomic and international debates. He will be followed by Robert Z. Lawrence, Albert L. Williams Professor of Trade and Investment at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's also been a senior fellow, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute since 2001, after having served as a member of President Clinton's, Council of Economic Advisors. He had a long and distinguished career at the Brookings Institution, where he founded and edited the Brookings Trade Forum. And he previously has been a lecturer and instructor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at Yale. He served as a consultant to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the World Bank, the OECD, and UNCTAD. And I saw him in Brussels when he was giving training to members of DG Trade, and so is the perfect person for this task. We then turn to Nicolas Véron, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, who is also Senior Fellow at Bruegel, which he worked with Jean Pisani-Ferry to co-found. He's the host of the Peterson Institute's Financial Statements virtual event series, which I highly recommend. A graduate of École Polytechnique and École Nationale Supérieure des Mines de Paris. He has held various positions in the public and private sectors and is currently serving as a board member of the derivatives arm of the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, a global financial infrastructure company. Jacob Kirkegaard will follow him. Jacob has been affiliated with the Institute since 2002, as a senior fellow since 2013, and recently took up residence at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels since this last September. He covers a wide range of issues at the intersection of political economy, national security, investment, and policy economics, as well as having longstanding research interests in demographic, long-term welfare states and human welfare. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University and has previously been at University of Aarhus in Denmark and Columbia University in New York. Finally, our newest senior fellow, Reinhilde Veugelers, who is, of course, a full professor of management, strategy, and innovation at KU Leuven in Belgium. She's also a senior fellow at Bruegel. Her research focuses on industrial organization, international economic strategy, and particularly innovation in science. She is a CEPR research member and a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium for Sciences and of the Academia Europeana. She spent 2004 to 2008 on leave as advisor at the European Commission, Bureau of European Policy Analysis. And that understates her influence. She has been a visiting professor at many of the leading business schools in the US and Europe, including Sloan, Stern, and Kellogg. And she is a co-principal investigator on the Science of Science Funding Initiative at the National Bureau of Economic Research. That is the order in which we'll hear our colleagues. Again, thank you all for bearing with us, and we look forward to the insights my colleagues can share. Their memos are available on the Peterson Institute microsite, Rebuilding the Global Economy, as well as directly on the Peterson Institute website. John, please.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to be short because the memo, which is addressed to the President of the European Commission, deals with macro issues which we already discussed in the previous webcast, as well as with micro issues which are more the topic of this webcast. So I'm going to limit myself to a few remarks. Wherever you're looking, for directions in the EU as regards the global economy, you're hearing the same response. The EU wants to be more outward-oriented, it wants to be more assertive, it wants to be more geopolitical, it wants to be more strategic. And the question is, what does that mean in practice? I think it means, first, that two of the traditional stances of the EU in global affairs are being put into question. The first one was the predominance of economic priorities over virtually everything else. The EU defined itself and was regarded as a trade player as a competition player, as a regulation player, but not so much as a geopolitical player. And now the EU wants to change in this regard. The second is that the EU was characterized by a strong preference for a world of rules and global governance, which is a world that is in trouble, to say the least, and has been put in trouble not only by the Trump administration, but also by the more broadly the geopolitical context. And so the EU is in the process of redefining itself in these two dimensions. Because the landscape is different, the landscape is more geopolitical, it's much more determined by the US-China rivalry, and because the global order is in pieces. So let me just take two cases and discuss very briefly what it means. My first case is a China strategy. In comparison to the US, the EU woke up quite lately to the China challenge. Discussion is still ongoing, in fact. Really the first strong statement in this regard were the report by the German Employers Federation, the BDI, which triggered a series of discussion in Germany and predated the release of the EU paper. That was not 2 years, not yet 2 years ago. It was in January 19. That tells you something about the lag with respect to the discussion that were being held in Washington. The important, I think, discussion in this regard is that although the EU is waking up to the China challenge, the China challenge is not the same for the EU as it is for the US. For the US, I would say China is first and foremost a geopolitical rival, a country whose very rise is a problem. For the EU, it's not that much the rise of China, it's the way China behaves and the concepts China is putting forward in international relations. The vision that China has of international relations challenges the very basis of the European vision and the preference for a world of rules, for a world of institution that has characterized the EU. That's what it meant by what the EU calls a systemic rival. So a rival not in terms of sheer power, but in terms of the type of rules, the type of principles that are being put forward in international discussions. So it's clear that the EU shares many of the US grievances with China, that there is much room for dialogue and for joint action, but that it should be kept in mind that the perspective is not exactly the same. My second example is the climate issue. So the EU now has defined climate as a sort of a major, almost overriding priority that is going to drive its development in the years to come. And it's being addressed in the framework of very, very loose global arrangements. I mean, the Paris Agreement and whatever comes out of the Glasgow conference is going to be very loose. So how is it going to play out in terms of the external implication of this strategy? The EU is going to disrupt, in a way, the global trading system. The EU is going to introduce inevitably, if it's serious about its climate program, carbon border adjustment. That is going to be a challenge to the way the trade is being conducted, not because of protectionist preferences, or not necessarily because of protectionist preferences, but just because there's a clash, there's a coming clash between climate and trade in a world where countries move at different speeds as regard their decarbonization. So it's going to be a significant issue for the EU. And a second issue, which also links to the geopolitics, is that it's going to affect its neighborhood in a very, very significant way. You have countries in the neighborhood of Europe that just export energy to the EU, fossil fuels to the EU. And these countries are going to be deeply affected by the transition taking place in the EU. So the question for Europe is how to take responsibility for all that, for for the external consequences of its internal preferences, which means designing a climate-friendly carbon border adjustment mechanism, which means forging climate coalitions, which means addressing the spillover on neighbors. So important challenges that are quite different from those Europe is used to. So these are only two examples, but my point, and then let me conclude on that, is that by early January, when the new US administration comes in and starts defining really its stance and its view on a range of international issues, it's going to be dealing with a Europe that is still in the process of defining its own stance, because Europe is in the process of adjusting its perception and its preferences as regards international economic relation, as regards how to rebuild the global economy. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Jean. I recommend to all Jean's memo to the European Commissioner, European Commission, and the President, because of this casting the international situation as related to economic policy in a real vision. And I think John has it right when he says for Europe, it's not the fact of China's rise, but the manner of China's current rise that is the issue, as well as the underlying issues around climate change. And we will be doing more work on both those topics in 2021. Let me now turn to Robert Lawrence to talk about advice to the incoming European Commissioner for Trade.
Thank you, Adam. Let me begin by saying that the current situation offers opportunities and challenges. President-elect Joe Biden has announced his intention to strengthen US alliances and to participate in international institutions. And that provides a new opportunity for the European Union to set its global trading strategy on a new path. And I believe there are three elements that are necessary to do that. And these are the priorities that I will be elaborating upon. The first is to reinvigorate the US-EU trade relationship. The second is to assist in revitalizing the World Trade Organization. And the third, which Jean has already started to refer to, is to implement a more coordinated response to the systemic problems presented by Chinese policies. But I also would like to stress that it's necessary to be realistic because the Biden administration, although it has announced a new international posture, has certainly signaled that in its first few years, it's going to give its highest priority to domestic issues that are of great concern to the United States. And so the European Trade Commission should not automatically assume that the trade questions will be put at the forefront of the measures that are taken in the initial years. So let me outline, and I think Europe and the United States will do best when the initiatives that they take in the trade area accord with their domestic priorities. These include climate, these include rebuilding through infrastructure, these include dealing with COVID. So these are major priorities, and so they should craft the trade initiatives to resonate with those domestic issues. So for the first priority, restoring the US-EU trade relationship, I think it's necessary first to try to deal with the existing frictions that exist between the two sides. Firstly, the Boeing Airbus subsidy conflict. I think this would be best resolved by initially having a standstill. Both sides have been authorized to retaliate against one another through the WTO, but they should not initiate those retaliations, but should rather work on a subsidies code that would allow for aircraft development, but within defined limits. Although I would suggest that in one area, there be no limits on subsidies, and that is for green fuels and technologies for aircraft. That again would resonate with both of their emphasis on the issue of climate. I think the second major friction relates to steel and aluminum. And there, we should be honest, the real problems are those of excess capacity rather than the current way in which the US posed the problem, and that is of alleged national security concerns, of course, in the case of the US in EU, between allies. So the administration should be ready to remove the steel and aluminum national security tariffs on EU products, but simultaneously announce new steel and aluminum procurement plans that fit into its infrastructure and clean energy programs, because these would help boost the global steel market. And in return, the European Union should eliminate its retaliatory tariffs and increase its NATO contributions. And both sides should use the WTO subsidies code to challenge practices that have been leading to excess capacity emanating from China and other countries. But in this context, I think it's important to stress that any ambitious goals, such as the transatlantic trade investment partnership, should be placed on the back burner. The party should instead take what was very fruitful in those negotiations and emphasize those, in particular, the efforts to cooperate on regulations and standards, which included the mutual recognition of those deemed to be equivalent, with an emphasis on transportation, health, and renewable energy. They also will be working on a new US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which has been proposed by the EU. I think this is a good proposal, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it from Reinhilde later on. The parties also need to agree to bolster supply chains in health and strategic minerals, but the goal should be preserving open trade rather than emphasizing self-sufficiency in this area. There's also a need to deal with e-commerce. That's a promising area, but it really requires an agreement on taxation, and that would require the US going back to the table and negotiations taking place through the aegis of the OECD. Let me turn to the second priority, which relates to revitalizing the WTO. The first easy step would be the United States joining the consensus in appointing Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the next Director General. The next is a major source of tensions, which relates to the reform of the appellate body. The European has led by establishing a temporary alternative to the appellate body, but the impasse over the US refusal to fulfill vacancies remains unsolved. So we need an agreement that would involve reform proposals that would make the appellate body more disciplined in not overreaching its mandate. I also believe that one dimension that isn't given sufficient attention, but is a major irritant for the United States, relates to the intrusion in the administration of trade remedies. And so more scope should be given to the domestic administration of these remedies, and more generally, the inefficiencies in the appellate body operating procedures. I think in addition, we need new plurilateral agreements. The WTO should have a more variable geometry that can accommodate the wishes of those members who seek deeper agreements that not all members would necessarily join. And the subjects for these should be those that have become standard in both the EU and the US regional agreements. Those would include topics like investment, services, e-commerce, and labor standards. Also, in agreements on environmental goods and pharmaceuticals and medical supplies should be pursued. So this would be a way to mitigate some of the competition and competitive pressures that the WTO is experiencing from regional agreements, which are dealing with issues that are more relevant to many of the participants, but not all. And that's why a plurilateral form of the agreement would make more sense. I also think we need reforms in two areas of trade remedies. The first, which has been overlooked, relates to safeguards. These can provide temporary trade barriers when injury can be proven, and can also play a vital role as a buffer that leads to forms of cushioning the blow of international trade without having the finger pointing about unfair trade practices. There are structural problems in implementing the safeguards, and these need to be overcome before they can be viable. Secondly, there's the area of subsidies. There's been some groundwork laid already between the European Union, the United States, and Japan. These need to be built upon, and perhaps a new plurilateral negotiated in this area. The third priority is, of course, towards China. And there, I think, we need a realistic approach that steers between extreme decoupling, which has been sought by the Trump administration on the one hand, and the inadequate responses to harmful Chinese practices in the past. And so what we need is a much more coordinated response. We need to be wary of excessive Western dependence on China, which raises the risks of opening opportunities for technological and trade blackmail. But at the same time, mutual interdependence is a much better cement for peaceful interactions than acrimonious efforts at extreme separation. So the way to approach China is to build on the more effective WTO that I hope we can reconstruct, and its restored appellate body to challenge Chinese practices, but in a way that is consistent with the GATT rules. Of course, these involves areas like violations of intellectual property rights, forcing technology transfers, employing poorly disclosed subsidies, and generating excess capacity in international markets. I also think that while both sides have tried to negotiate agreements over bilateral investment using treaties, and apparently it looks like the EU is moving more rapidly to achieve such an agreement. Nonetheless, there should be joint US-EU policies basically using the premise or using the principle that Chinese foreign investment and technology acquisition opportunities would only be allowed on a reciprocal basis. Where industries are closed to foreign investment, they should not be opened to Chinese investment in either of the two economies. Where there are genuine national security and strategic threats, the European Union and the US should also work with other countries to strengthen procurement restrictions and implement coordinated export controls on the sale of products and products and technologies to China. So I think this is a strategy in which each of the three components would reinforce one another, because a more effective WTO and a restoration of the EU-US-China relationship would allow us to deal with China and indeed to advance the and to deal with some of the current problems that are impeding the multilateral trading system.
Thank you, Robert. And it's great to have a practical vision for using the WTO in beneficial ways rather than multilateralism as just a knee-jerk ideal. And this is where Robert's summary comes out. Let me now turn to our colleague Nicolas Véron. We are going in an order that sort of makes sense in that we are moving from the most international to the most internal, but they all have an international aspect for the EU. And clearly financial services is a freighted issue or a weighty issue for international deliberation. Nicolas, please.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks for having promoted and made it happen, this project on rebuilding the global economy, which has also forced us who work mostly on EU issues to look at them not just from a domestic European Union perspective and the inward-looking focus, which is very common in Brussels, but also on what the EU decisions will mean for the global economy. And my memo on financial services, so now addressed to Commissioner Merit McGuinness, who just took that position, is actually focused on the international aspects. So it's not putting emphasis so much on what the EU should do for its own domestic financial system, even so I will talk about it, but really to emphasize how the European Union, through its decisions at EU level on financial services topics, has power and leverage on a global scale. Financial services are not the highest drama area right now, which is good news compared with 10 or 12 years ago. This is not at the forefront of what keeps people busy in terms of extinguishing fires, certainly compared with trade topics, as Robert just mentioned, and also macro issues. The COVID-19 crisis indeed has vindicated a number of the reforms that had been undertaken in the previous decade or so, particularly Basel III on the resilience of banking balance sheets. And I would go as far as saying as the development since the COVID-19 pandemic hit has been a triumphal vindication of the Basel III reforms. The banks, as many of their lobbyists, but also independent observers have noted, have been part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. As in the previous crisis, there have been a number of questions about market liquidity issues, especially during the episode in mid-March, the so-called dash for cash. But by and large, certainly from a European perspective, the developments in the beginning of the pandemic have not put into question in a major way the reforms that the European Union had introduced, some of them align with the global agenda in the previous cycle. Also, if you look at the arrival of a new administration in the US, the Biden administration will not be focused in an initial phase on financial services issue, not to say they're not being important, and of course appointments to the key agencies will be very significant, but in terms of immediate emergencies that the Biden administration has to deal with, financial services are probably low on the list. But it is important, and I will argue it is important for at least two reasons. One, financial instability remains a threat at any time, and therefore building a more resilient financial system where the roof proverbially has been repaired when the times were good so that it's resilient when times get bad is something that is extremely important right now, especially given the neglect of international coordination in many ways during the past 4 years. Even so, in this area of financial services, it has not been as extreme and destructive as in other areas from a US perspective, like trade or climate change. But also because this is an area where the EU has very significant power and leverage. There has been already considerable pooling of policy decision at the EU level, and there will probably be more in the times to come. And there is also tremendous structural change of which foreign observers, but also frankly domestic European observers are not always aware. Structural change in the European financial system itself. So having planted that scene, here are the priorities that my memo, which will be published soon, suggests for the European Commissioner on the international, globally significant aspects of the financial services agenda. First, there is a pretty elaborate global infrastructure and international infrastructure of oversight of the global financial system with standard setters like the Basel committees. There are lots of acronyms. The Financial Stability Board is coordinating all that. But I argue that it's time to think of the next step. That certainly not supervision of global banks at the global level, because this is utopian and certainly not achievable, but also not necessarily desirable in the near term. One thing that the Eurozone crisis has demonstrated is the extent to which banks are linked to the monetary system and to currency areas. Actually, many advocates of supervisory integration into EU, including the IMF, including others, myself included, had long said that to the extent that the European Union should build a single supervisory system, it should be at the scale of the entire single market. But what we've learned in the crisis, particularly in 2012, is that the urgency of doing that was in the Eurozone, and that's how banking union happened. So similarly, if you look at the global level, the supervision of banks is something that will remain at the level of individual jurisdictions. But what is needed for a step up is supervising information platform, information intermediaries, risk assessment systems, those which require supervision. Think of rating agencies, think of trade repositories, and Adam reminded us of my affiliation as an independent board member with the trade repository arm of DTCC here. So this is in a way at the forefront. Global policymakers need to be able to monitor exposures, monitor market developments in real time. And for that, you need not just harmonized standards, you need platforms that provide the information in a usable way. We don't have that yet. This has been one of the major lessons of the mid-March Dash for Cash, and the EU should lead on that. To be able to lead, it should do two more things that will give it more heft. One is to streamline its own representation, the European representation, in the key global financial standard setters and bodies. And this includes particularly the Basel Committee, where the EU currently has about 1/3 of the representation. This is not corresponding to the state of things. With the advent of banking union, the single supervisory mechanism, bank supervisory policy in the EU is set at the EU level, at the Eurozone level. So there is absolutely no justification for having 7 Eurozone countries individually represented on the Basel Committee: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So these should be streamlined so that the EU become more legitimate, because seen from the rest of the world, these multiple representations are completely unjustifiable and decrease, not increase, the influence of the EU in those discussions. Similarly, the EU should become improve its compliance with global financial standards so that it leads by example. This is particularly the case for financial reporting standards, accounting standards, where the EU still has opt-outs, and for the Basel standards on bank supervision, where the EU has been found materially non-compliant. Then there are more domestic issues on which the EU, by completing integration of its instruments, will also bolster its influence and its credibility on the international stage. I'm not going into any details here, but a more complete banking union, a more real capital markets union, and an effective anti-money laundering supervision at the EU level, which is being discussed actively in the latter case, will support a greater international role of the EU and a greater influence of the EU in global discussions. So let me move to conclusion, and Jessica, if you can show the slide on the screen. The conclusion is that the EU has a lot to do with the global influence of its financial services policy in mind. There's a tremendous agenda for reform domestically in the EU in this area, but the international spillovers are extremely significant. And it shouldn't wait for the US to lead. Even so, with the the Biden administration, there will be more scope for leadership of the US in this area as other actually, the Biden administration will not be focused at all on financial services, certainly in its first year of operation or so. And so the EU should not be shy about taking initiative at the international or even global level in this area, with coordination with the US, also with other jurisdictions, but being self-aware and able to take leadership where it matters. Thank you very much.
Again, Nicolas, thank you. And again, it is a great compliment and full part of what we're talking about, as you say, that the banks are not the central issue that they were a dozen years ago, but that Europe doesn't need to wait for the US to lead and has important effects on the rest of the world through this channel. That is a through line of our discussion today. And with that in mind, let me turn to Jacob Kirkegaard, who is dealing with issues of digital and market, which of course are highly sensitive in a transatlantic context, but matter for everyone. Jacob.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. It's a pleasure to join today's event. Well, let's start by saying, I mean, this is a memo addressed to the Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager, who also doubles as the EU Commission Vice President for the entire digital agenda, which arguably, depending on how you define that, could be said to influence most policy areas. But I think it's fair to say that competition policy has always been a very important policy area for the EU, and probably, generally speaking, is even more so now when the EU, together with other parts of the global economy, finds itself in a position where there are broad-based slowdowns of productivity. We clearly have a corporate concentration levels ongoing, and therefore this is arguably an area that is even more important at this particular junction. Then it also should be said that within the EU, there has always been a tendency for the European Commission to use those areas where it has the most political competence or power, that be trade or particularly competition, to try to increase its level of influence also on other areas, other policy areas, be it taxes and things like that. I think where the global economy, the European economy finds itself right now, in light of recent technological advancements, as well as the increased role played by many state-linked entities, that this is not the time to be an expansive actor. It's rather a time to focus on the core competences of DG Competition's area. And that means, in my opinion, that it should focus on addressing the competitive distortions increasingly self-evident in the digital economy, as well as seek to regulate the role of state-linked actors. That means that, in my opinion, there are three priorities for the Commissioner for Competition and Vice President for Digital Affairs. That is regulating gatekeeper platform managing businesses. It is regulating the role of big data in the European and global economies, and then it is, addressing the issues of state aid subsidies related to state-linked entities. But it is very clear also that these two areas are inherently global in scope. That means that when the Commission sets itself the task of regulating these policy areas, it should do so with a global lenses on, so to speak. It is not enough, in my opinion, to simply threaten to, exclude certain actors from the European internal markets if they do not comply with European rules. There is a very clear premium on addressing these issues with international partners and in international forums, including potentially even the WTO. And it is particularly the case right now when we have recently seen some pretty significant policy announcement by US federal and state antitrust authorities in launching investigations of the very companies, Facebook and Google in particular, that are at the very core of these issues. So the Commission really needs to make a concerted effort, in my opinion, to reach out to especially the incoming Biden administration, but also other potential international partners in these areas. So the three priorities, in my opinion. The first one is regulating the so-called gatekeeper platforms and digital gatekeeper companies. Fortunately, just last week, the Commission made what I consider to be a pretty good start on this by launching its digital Management Act, and basically aiming at regulating these companies. And this is an act that aims to settle a lot of the level playing field concerns that have been focusing centered on these companies, but basically laying out a list of things that these companies can do and must do, and what they cannot do, because they are companies that run both platforms on which transactions are carried out, and of course also often compete directly for transactions on these very platforms. They, for instance, must now make the aim is to level the playing field between themselves and third-party conveyors or players on these platforms. They now, and this is very important, also going forward, they need to make the data that is collected on transactions by third parties available to these parties. They cannot monopolize this. And they clearly need to facilitate also platform shifting. They are no longer allowed to promote unfairly their own products on their own platforms. They need to facilitate linking also to third parties outside their platforms. So fundamentally, this is about establishing a level playing field. These are good aspirations, and I believe goes in the right direction. But my main concern, or if you like, desire, is for the Commission to ensure that they enforce this new Digital Markets Act with the intention, or do so preemptively, because we know that this is a marketplace in which facts on the ground are established very quickly, and therefore the Commission should, in my opinion, adopt a preemptive regulatory strategy of basically imposing injunctions against certain activities, certain mergers and acquisitions, and then only later run the risk that having these decisions challenged or perhaps overturned by the European Court of Justice. That is a risk worth taking. The second priority, in my opinion, which is probably more important going forward, deals with the overall regulation of big data. Currently, the policy topic of big data is really centered on the platform economies, the platform businesses, those that companies that have been able, through their control of online advertising, search functions, and e-commerce, to assemble these very large data sets, apply types of machine learning to them, and arguably thereby monopolizing the benefits from artificial intelligence that can be derived from big data sets. Regulation at the European level should recognize that access to big data is essentially a fundamental building block of future innovative capacity, and therefore should, in my opinion, be view big data sets as essentially the equivalent of a patent, which for regulatory purposes means that there should be a balanced approach. On the one hand, you should obviously provide companies or entities with a financial incentive to collect big data sets, but there should also be a requirement for this data set to be publicly shared after a certain period of exclusivity, depending on the size of the nature of the data set in question. So this is currently crucially focused on the big platform platform businesses. But going forward, especially in a world of 5G networks, I think it's very important to recognize that this is not something that is related solely to the to these particular companies, or for that matter, even social media and online transaction platforms. Once 5G networks are in place, we're going to see that you can pretty much be sure that big data sets can be collected in every sector of the economy. And it is not necessarily the case.
Jacob, we need you to start wrapping up, please.
Yes, this is not necessarily something that is associated solely with the currently in vogue large US technology firms. Then lastly, the third priority is, as I said, linking or controlling the activities of state-linked actors. Here, it is not just China, but obviously actions of Chinese companies, because of the size of China and because of the authoritarian political system there. It is a country that is naturally the most directly affected. Here, especially in light of what also Robert mentioned, that there may be a comprehensive agreement for investment between the EU and China, but we also know that whether or not China subsequently chooses to unilaterally change the rules, as we've seen with the agreements on Hong Kong, or arguably in some ways the FTA that it has with Australia, there is clearly an important enforcement issue here for DG Competition, because it will be DG Competition that is going to, or should be responsible for the careful evaluation of whether or not Chinese entities wishing to participate in tender offers within the EU market, as well as investing, seeking to acquire European companies, are in fact benefiting from illegal subsidies from either the state-owned financial system or other sources of state subsidies. So in the interest of time, let me finish there.
Thank you, Jacob. Your memo is very rich, and I encourage people to read it, as these will be issues which I know you and the Institute will be returning to repeatedly. I would now like to turn to Professor Reinhilde Veugelers with the most far-reaching, in a sense, and forward-looking piece of this agenda, dealing with the innovation issue. And it obviously dovetails in particular with Jacob's on issues of transatlantic competition and how the EU defines its, I don't want to say national interest, its union's interest in this new digital world. Reinhilde, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So indeed, although there is one commissioner who has innovation in her title, this memo is really addressed to all commissioners that have innovation somehow in their competence field, and those are many. In the post-COVID recovery, I don't think I have to convince you that this will require science, technology, and innovation. The health challenge has made that very clear, but also for tackling climate change, new technologies and new innovations will definitely be important. This science, technology, innovation is driven by corporate innovators, although the public sector does play an important co-piloting role. And on the global technology landscape, digital technologies and services have become the largest part of that landscape, as Jacob already mentioned. And then if you look at how Europe was positioned in this global technology landscape already pre-COVID, there was a persistent business corporate R&D gap relative to the US. That was not due to our traditional sectors of strength like automobiles and pharmaceuticals, but it was basically due because we missed the digital revolution with positions in new technology sectors and particularly in the digital service sectors. Europe did have a bustling digital startup scene, but what we missed were actually these big tech firms, especially the critical gatekeepers, like Jacob already mentioned, which are the US or Chinese companies here. And that may matter because we do see that there is a little turbulence in these gatekeeper leadership positions here. So Europe may also be missing pole positions in the future in these new digital technologies in the digital sectors, but also in the non-digital races, which were strengths like automobiles or biopharma. The application of new digital technology intensive services will be very important for the new races to come in these sectors. Think of the electric, autonomous, connected cars. Think of bioengineering, gene editing for biopharma. So also digital technologies will be very important for all the races to come in those sectors where Europe currently still has a digital technology lead. So within that context, and also within the context of very fast changing global technology environments, where there is a very ambitious China who wants to become science and technology powerhouse in future, the US tech giants continuing to dominate pivotal digital platforms, also the rise of more protectionist my country first perspectives in the world. It's no surprise that these perspectives have also shown up in Europe, and on the innovation policy area has been translated in the rhetoric on technologies, a call for technology sovereignty. And the danger is that if this rhetoric is used wrongly in a very protective, closing borders, self-sufficiency perspective, that might not be the right response here and might actually set Europe further back. So that's why my key priorities are addressing how should we respond to these trends towards technology sovereignty, so that it really leads to a strength of Europe rather than putting us further behind. So Jessica, if you can show the slide with my key priorities. As Robert already said, it should not be about self-sufficiency, and as also Jacob has already mentioned, it should be about building and defending a global technology space that is a fair level playing field. It should be about making sure that that global technology space remains open and provides open access to key technologies to all players who want to build technology positions here. And such an open global technology space should enable our EU firms to build leading technology positions, or at least be an unavoidable technology partner in globally designed value chains. So that's assuring that technology sovereignty, so should not be about trying to shield our EU companies from the global creative destruction process on global technology markets. It should be about making sure that those global technology landscapes remain open to access to key technologies, and about regulating or fining firms that would prohibit that access to key technologies or would prevent EU firms to capture value from their innovative strategies that they develop within these global value chains. How to avoid being blocked from key technologies or components by other countries is not just only about making sure that there is a global level playing field with sanctions based on multilateral regulations. It's also about, and perhaps even more so, about preventing dependency by making sure that you diversify your technology portfolio and that you also master technologies that allow you to be very modular and flexible, avoiding dependence on key components or key materials here. So the technology strengths in modular technologies should make you much less technology dependent and build technological sovereignty here. Technology sovereignty in that respect is also more about making sure that we also have a very strong position at the multilateral table, making sure that Europe is a force incontournable in these international coalitions to shape the global fair level playing field. And if we have such a strong force, we make it actually more more costly for other countries to go for country-first strategies here, being not able anymore to collaborate and cooperate with strong EU players here. So overall, I think the whole call for technology sovereignty requires actually a very strong internal policy agenda to build a very strong EU, an EU single market, and an EU strong innovative capacity. That's the best reaction to build technological sovereignty. I have in my memo also suggestions on how that internal strength should actually be built here, and that's the best way to deal with technological sovereignty in the future, which will make Europe stronger rather than weaker within a self-sufficient perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Reinhilde. Thanks to all of my colleagues, Reinhilde, Jacob, Nicolas, Robert, and Jean, for providing such important guidance to the globe and to the top policymakers in Europe. Just to conclude, this is the last event of phase 1 of rebuilding the global economy from the Peterson Institute. We have done quite a bit in these last few weeks. We've published or are about to have published 40 memos to top policymakers, all brief, pointed, and ready to reach the policymakers as well as the broader public. This is our 13th event featuring over 50 fellows, board members, and global thought leaders. And we've had global attendance from over 60 countries, including all G20 countries, of course, many viewers from the US, but also particularly UK, Canada, Germany, Belgium, Japan, and Australia. And we've been averaging until today's technical glitch, 200 to 400 webinar participants each time. This is phase 1, and we move in the new year into phase 2 of rebuilding, where we will start to assemble how the individual policymakers need to cooperate across borders in ways that are mutually beneficial, but yet practical and attainable. As I've said repeatedly, we chose the word rebuilding consciously. This is not some architectural fantasy about setting up new regimes or an ideal state. This is about renovating the global economy in which we all live, in order to allow accessibility and space enough for everybody and make it more resilient to the storms we face, starting with the pandemic and climate change, but needing the kind of growth for the long term that all of our colleagues today spoke about. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to reconvening in the new year to continue the work of rebuilding the global economy at the Peterson Institute.